Welcome. It is good to have you here as we begin this foundational material. This content is for informational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute financial, legal, or tax advice. Always consult a qualified professional before making financial or legal decisions. This is an unofficial, independently produced audiobook. It is not affiliated with, endorsed by, or connected to Comply Advantage in any way. All trademarks belong to their respective owners. This chapter establishes the core architectural foundations of our compliance framework, introducing the mandatory anti-money laundering controls that protect modern financial systems from systemic abuse. Over the next few lessons, we will map out the complete structural anatomy of regulatory defense, moving systematically from initial identification to complex ownership tracking and automated transaction monitoring. You will learn to see these components not as isolated administrative tasks, but as tightly coupled subsystems designed to mitigate evolving operational risks. By looking at how these distinct protocols interact, you will develop the specialized vocabulary and structural understanding needed to design, implement, and audit resilient compliance workflows. Our immediate focus is to transition your perspective from a passive, rule-bound approach to an active, engineering-minded model of threat mitigation. We start by unpacking the regulatory landscape of 2026, a world defined by centralized scrutiny under bodies like Europe's Anti-Money Laundering Authority and increasingly unified global compliance playbooks. You will explore why identity verification is merely the entry point of a continuous life cycle rather than a static checkpoint executed once during customer onboarding. We will define the precise operational boundaries of the compliance professional, establish the mathematical and qualitative realities of the risk-based approach, and demonstrate why meticulous audit trails are your final line of defense against enforcement actions. See you in the next lecture. Comply Advantage. Hello and welcome back. When we design an onboarding pipeline for financial services, we must establish a reliable baseline of who our customers are. This initial phase of customer due diligence requires us to extract and verify specific, foundational data points from the applicant before we can reasonably execute any downstream risk assessments. For an individual, this minimal baseline always includes their full legal name, date of birth, and residential address, while a corporate entity demands its registered legal name, official business address, incorporation number, and proof of legal existence. We do not collect these data points as a matter of bureaucratic ceremony, but because they serve as the unique keys required to query external verification networks. If the data entered at this entry point is incomplete, inaccurate, or unstructured, every subsequent step in your automated compliance pipeline will produce unreliable results. Therefore, our primary objective during customer identification is ensuring absolute accuracy and integrity of these core data points at the exact moment of entry. To verify individual identities, the modern regulatory architecture relies heavily on digital onboarding frameworks that replace physical face-to-face interactions. In this remote context, verification must be executed by cross-referencing government-issued identity documentation against independent, authoritative databases. A valid identity document, such as a passport or a biometric driver's license, serves as a physical credential containing cryptographic chips or high-security printing features that specialized scanning software can validate remotely. However, simple optical character recognition of an ID card is no longer sufficient on its own, meaning the document must be biometrically bound to the living person presenting it. This binding requires automated systems to extract the reference image from the document and compare it to a real-time biometric facial scan captured during the onboarding session. By pairing this document analysis with real-time database cross-referencing against credit bureaus, electoral rolls, or municipal registers, we confirm not only that the identity credential is textually valid, but that it actively exists in the real world. VOV ID +1. The shift toward non-face-to-face identification has significantly changed the threat landscape, introducing sophisticated vectors like synthetic identity fraud and artificial intelligence-generated deepfakes. A synthetic identity does not rely on a single stolen record, but rather combines real, stolen data fragments, such as a genuine national identification number, with fabricated names and false credit histories to create an entirely new persona. Traditional database queries often fail to detect these entities because the individual components look perfectly consistent on paper. Furthermore, fraudsters frequently leverage generative artificial intelligence to produce highly convincing deepfake videos or images to bypass standard liveness checks during biometric capture. To defend against these presentation attacks, compliance infrastructure must employ advanced passive liveness detection models trained specifically to identify subtle digital artifacts and microexpressions that indicate synthetic media. If our identification systems cannot detect these advanced physical anomalies at the gate, we risk welcoming completely fraudulent entities into our financial ecosystem. Some sub plus 3. Corporate customer identification presents a distinct set of operational challenges that go far beyond checking a standard government-issued passport. When onboarding an enterprise, we are tasked with verifying a legal fiction, which requires us to systematically review official corporate registries, articles of association, and certificates of good standing. The core difficulty here lies in the structural complexity of modern legal entities, which can use layers of holding companies, shell corporations, and offshore trusts specifically designed to obscure their operational realities. Our identification process must accurately map these corporate hierarchies, extracting registration numbers and legal statuses from authoritative government registries to prove the business is active and legally authorized to operate. This structural mapping must be completed with absolute precision, as it forms the necessary foundation for the subsequent and more complex task of identifying the actual human beings who control the entity. Blockchain Counsel. An identity check is fundamentally incomplete if we do not simultaneously capture the purpose and intended nature of the business relationship. During onboarding, the compliance system must explicitly gather data regarding why the customer is opening the account, their expected transaction volumes, and the geographic regions they intend to interact with. Collecting this information creates an essential baseline profile that describes what normal, legitimate behavior should look like for this specific customer. Without this baseline data, it is mathematically impossible for transaction monitoring systems to accurately identify anomalies or suspicious activity later in the customer lifecycle. We collect purpose of account data to give context to future transactions, allowing the institution to distinguish between a massive, unexpected cross-border wire transfer and routine, predictable business operations. Finally, we must recognize that customer identification is not a static, point-in-time event that ends once onboarding is complete. Regulators explicitly expect institutions to maintain continuous data hygiene, ensuring that identification records remain current and accurate across the entire customer lifecycle. People move to new houses, change their names through marriage, and renew expired passports, while corporate entities frequently alter their legal names, structures, or operational locations. Relying on calendar-based, periodic reviews to catch these updates creates unacceptable windows of risk, which is why modern compliance architectures are moving toward event-driven re-verification models. When a customer triggers a specific risk signal, such as an unexpected change in geographic activity or a modification to account ownership, the system must dynamically require updated identity documentation. Keeping identity data continuously clean and up-to-date ensures that our risk classifications and sanction screening pipelines are always evaluating accurate customer information. Blockchain Counsel Plus 2. See you in the next lecture. Hello, and welcome back. When we look at a corporate entity, we're dealing with a legal abstraction, but financial crime is committed by people, which means our compliance efforts must ultimately anchor themselves to real human beings. Identifying the ultimate beneficial owner, or UBO, is the process of peeling back the layers of legal personality to find the individuals who truly own or control the entity. The standard regulatory threshold across most jurisdictions requires us to identify any natural person who directly or indirectly holds 25% or more of the shares or voting rights. It is a common misconception that this is a simple mathematical exercise of reading a share registry, but in practice, you will routinely encounter multi-layered ownership structures spanning several countries. Our goal as compliance professionals is not merely to collect pieces of paper, but to construct a coherent, verified map of the entire ownership chain until we reach the top. If we fail to do this, we risk allowing the financial institution to be used by anonymous actors hiding behind corporate veils to launder illicit funds. To begin this mapping process, we must systematically collect objective evidence, starting from the target entity and working our way upward. Official state company registries provide a logical starting point, but they are rarely sufficient on their own because their data quality varies wildly by jurisdiction and is often unverified at the point of submission. Therefore, we must supplement registry data with primary corporate documentation such as certified articles of association, share certificates, and shareholder registers. For example, if Company A is owned 80% by Company B, we cannot stop there. We must immediately request the corporate document for Company B to see who owns it. This process repeats iteratively, calculating the effective ownership at each level by multiplying the percentages down the chain. If an individual owns 60% of Company B, their indirect ownership in Company A is 48%, which clearly clears the 25% threshold and requires full verification of their identity. The math gets significantly more complicated when we encounter vehicles designed explicitly to obscure control, such as trusts, foundations, or shell companies located in secrecy jurisdictions. A trust does not have shareholders, so the standard 25% share calculation breaks down entirely, forcing us to look at control through other legal mechanisms. In the case of a trust, regulations require us to identify the settlor, the trustees, the protector if one exists, and the class of beneficiaries, because any of these parties can exercise effective control over the assets. Similarly, shell companies often utilize nominee directors or nominee shareholders who appear on public registries, but hold no actual economic interest or decision-making power. When you see a corporate structure where a company in a well-regulated jurisdiction is entirely owned by an entity in a notorious tax haven, this should immediately trigger an investigation into the underlying powers of attorney and nominee agreements to find the true decision-maker. During this verification process, you must actively look for specific red flags that indicate an entity is attempting to mislead or frustrate your investigation. A classic red flag is an unnecessarily complex or circular corporate structure, such as Company X being owned by Company Y, which is owned by Company Z, which in turn holds shares in Company X. There is rarely a legitimate commercial reason for such a configuration, and it is almost always designed to create an infinite loop that exhausts the analyst's patience. Other red flags include frequent changes in ownership or directorship without clear commercial justification, the use of bearer shares which transfer ownership by physical possession of the certificate, or corporate officers who lack the professional background to realistically manage a business of that scale. When these anomalies appear, you cannot accept the documentation at face value. You must escalate the file and demand independent, notarized proof of the economic reality of the structure. Ultimately, your verification is only as good as the audit trail you establish, meaning every single link in the ownership chain must be evidenced by concrete documentation. For every UBO identified, you must collect standard individual identification documents, such as a valid passport and proof of address, but you must also retain the exact corporate documents that prove they held that 25% threshold. If a structure resolves to a point where no single individual owns 25%, you are still not absolved of responsibility. You must identify and verify the natural person who holds the position of senior managing official instead. This means ensuring your files contain a clear, signed declaration from the client company alongside your own independently verified organizational chart that explicitly details how the conclusion was reached. By maintaining this disciplined approach to documentation, you ensure that the institution remains compliant and that your analysis can withstand scrutiny from internal auditors and external regulators alike. That concludes our look at beneficial ownership verification, and I will see you in the next lecture. Hello, and welcome back. When we build software or establish automated processes, we must ensure our systems mirror the reality of the environment they operate within. In anti-money laundering compliance, this means we cannot treat every business relationship as a uniform entity, because doing so creates an unsustainable operational burden and leaves blind spots where actual vulnerabilities exist. A robust compliance program relies heavily on a structured risk classification framework that segments your customer base into distinct, actionable tiers. The primary mechanism for managing this diversity is the division of customers into low, medium, and high-risk categories, which allows an organization to allocate its investigative resources where they are most critically required. By implementing a systematic approach to risk scoring, you ensure that the intensity of your verification efforts is strictly proportional to the potential threat. This balancing act is not merely an administrative preference. It is a fundamental requirement of modern regulatory expectations globally. To design an effective scoring model, your system must evaluate multiple independent vectors that collectively define the inherent threat of a customer relationship. The first critical vector is geographic risk, which requires assessing whether a client resides in or conducts business through jurisdictions with weak regulatory controls, high levels of corruption, or active international sanctions. Alongside geography, your framework must analyze the industry or business sector of the customer, recognizing that certain fields present elevated vulnerabilities. For instance, a local, public educational institution operates with high transparency, whereas cash-intensive businesses, online gambling platforms, or companies dealing in high-value commodities present an entirely different risk landscape. Beyond these foundational attributes, product usage acts as an essential multiplier in your matrix, because an automated clearinghouse service or a bulk cross-border wire product introduces significantly more vulnerability than a simple domestic deposit account. Finally, historical behavior and transaction patterns provide the empirical data needed to validate or challenge your initial assumptions about the customer's profile. Once these data points are processed through your risk matrix, the resulting classification dictates the precise depth and frequency of your subsequent due diligence procedures. A low-risk designation signals to the system that standard, or in some regulatory frameworks simplified, customer due diligence is sufficient, requiring only baseline identity verification and routine automated transaction monitoring. When a customer lands in the medium-risk tier, the compliance apparatus must escalate its focus, demanding a deeper analysis of international transaction patterns or more comprehensive corporate documentation. High-risk classifications, which often capture politically exposed persons or entities with complex, opaque beneficial ownership structures, trigger full enhanced due diligence protocols. This extreme tier demands the mandatory verification of the absolute source of wealth, more intensive background screening against adverse media, and explicit sign-off from senior management before the relationship can proceed. The entire architectural goal of this tiering is to create a direct, mathematically defensible correlation between the perceived vulnerability and the defensive measures deployed. A common failure mode in poorly designed compliance systems is treating this initial risk classification as a static, permanent attribute that remains unchanged throughout the life cycle of the account. In the real world, corporate entities mutate, businesses pivot into new operational territories, and individuals change their financial habits, meaning a classification made at onboarding can quickly become obsolete. To counter this decay of data accuracy, your compliance framework must incorporate rigorous strategies for periodic risk reviews alongside event-driven triggers. Low-risk accounts might only require a programmatic refresh of their profile data every 2 years, whereas high-risk accounts typically demand an exhaustive manual review on an annual or even semi-annual basis. Furthermore, your software systems must monitor for material shifts in business activities, such as a localized retail business suddenly initiating large volumes of international wire transfers or a sudden shift in corporate control to an offshore entity. When these deviations are captured, the system must dynamically adjust the classification, ensuring your compliance posture always mirrors actual operational exposure. See you in the next lecture. ASACA +3. Hello, and welcome back. When designing a robust, know your customer workflow, we must eventually confront the reality of external, non-negotiable legal restrictions. Screening is essential to avoid violating international sanctions and to manage relationships with politically exposed persons, or PEPs. These are individuals whose prominent public functions expose them to an elevated risk of corruption, bribery, or money laundering. To build a system that stands up to regulatory scrutiny, we cannot rely on manual or sporadic checks. Instead, we must architect a continuous ingestion pipeline that integrates global sanctions lists, adverse media monitoring, and PEP databases directly into the onboarding and lifecycle architecture of our customers. Our technical infrastructure must ingest and harmonize data from diverse, authoritative bodies, including the Office of Foreign Assets Control, the United Nations, and the European Union. A major engineering and operational challenge here is the persistent complexity of jurisdictional divergence in sanctions enforcement. What is explicitly prohibited by one regulatory body may be permitted or subject to completely different rules by another. For instance, an organization operating across both European and American borders must manage concurrent, sometimes conflicting legal mandates regarding asset freezing and transaction blocks. Your screening logic cannot treat global watch lists as a singular, monolithic entity. It must parse, categorize, and enforce rules based on the specific jurisdictional footprint of both the legal entity conducting the transaction and the customer being evaluated. When a name passes through our matching engines, it rarely produces a clean, binary result. The system will inevitably generate alerts based on fuzzy name-matching logic designed to catch intentional typos, phonetic variations, or alternative transliterations. The primary operational task for our compliance analysts is to resolve these potential matches and safely distinguish between true hits and false positives. A false positive occurs when the system flags an innocent customer due to a shared name or a similar string pattern, whereas a true hit confirms that the individual is indeed the person on the watch list. Resolving these alerts requires checking secondary, high-fidelity data identifiers. Analysts must meticulously cross-reference structural information like the date of birth, nationality, country of residence, physical address, and unique national identification numbers before any match can be safely cleared or confirmed. When a true match is confirmed, the system must trigger deterministic behavioral paths based on whether the entity is a sanctioned party or a PEP. If a client appears on a valid sanctions list, the compliance system must immediately lock the account, block transactions, and invoke necessary regulatory reporting procedures without exception. For confirmed PEPs, the relationship is not automatically rejected, but must be immediately subjected to enhanced due diligence protocols. This requires the thorough verification of the customer source of wealth and source of funds to ensure the money does not derive from public corruption. Furthermore, regulations mandate strict requirements for senior management escalation. A senior executive must formally review the collected intelligence and sign off on the risk profile before the business relationship can officially proceed. Every single phase of this investigative life cycle must be treated as a permanent record. Regulators do not merely inspect your final decisions. They evaluate the system and logic you use to arrive at those conclusions. You must ensure that all screenings, match resolutions, analyst comments, and senior management sign-offs are documented with sufficient audit evidence to satisfy potential regulatory inspections. Every alert generated by the system, along with the specific attributes compared and the precise justification for clearing it, must be stored in an unalterable audit trail. If an auditor asks why a specific name match was classified as a false positive, your system must be capable of replaying the exact evidence utilized by the analyst at that specific point in time. See you in the next lecture. Hello, and welcome back. When we build identity verification systems, we quickly find ourselves caught between two powerful, opposing regulatory forces. On one side, anti-money laundering mandates demand that we collect, analyze, and store vast quantities of deeply sensitive customer data. On the other side, modern privacy frameworks like the General Data Protection Regulation and the California Consumer Privacy Act command us to minimize data collection, restrict access, and delete information as soon as possible. Navigating this tension is not a matter of choosing which regulation to violate, because both carry severe penalties. Instead, an architect must design a system that satisfies the statutory preservation demands of financial regulators while rigorously honoring the individual privacy rights guaranteed by data protection authorities. This requires a systematic understanding of the data lifecycle, a clear view of lawful processing bases, and engineering practices that ensure security and transparency. By treating data privacy as an architectural constraint rather than an afterthought, we can build compliance operations that are both legally resilient and transparently auditable. The architectural foundation of an integrated compliance strategy begins with identifying a valid legal basis for processing sensitive personal data. Under frameworks like the General Data Protection Regulation, relying on explicit customer consent is often a fragile design choice for financial institutions. If a customer decides to withdraw their consent, a system built on that assumption risks grinding to a halt, yet anti-money laundering laws still legally forbid the immediate erasure of past identity records. To resolve this structural flaw, compliance systems should explicitly invoke the legal obligation basis for core identity verification and retention activities. When you collect a passport scan or a national identity number, you are doing so because a specific statutory directive commands your organization to perform customer due diligence. This structural separation ensures that if an individual submits a data erasure request, your system can legitimately refuse the deletion of mandatory audit trails. However, any supplementary data processing that falls outside strict statutory requirements must be justified under a separate basis, such as legitimate interests or explicit consent. Managing the life cycle of data from initial onboarding to final disposal requires strict adherence to the storage limitation principle, which explicitly conflicts with traditional hoarding habits. Anti-money laundering frameworks typically require organizations to retain customer due diligence records and transaction histories for a minimum statutory period, which is often 5 years after the business relationship ends. Data protection laws dictate that once this statutory objective has been fully achieved, the collected personal data must be permanently and securely expunged from all systems. This means that a compliance platform cannot simply archive records indefinitely under the vague justification that the data might become useful for a hypothetical future investigation. Instead, a system must implement deterministic retention policies that track the exact closure date of an account and trigger automated purging routines once the 5-year countdown concludes. For example, if a client terminates their relationship on a specific date, the system must precisely calculate the expiration boundary and ensure that associated biometric data and identification documents are shredded. Enforcing absolute security at rest and in transit is a non-negotiable requirement for protecting sensitive customer data against malicious exfiltration. The sheer volume of high-value information held within a customer due diligence repository makes it a prime target for sophisticated data breaches. To mitigate this risk, all data assets must be encrypted using robust standard protocols, such as Advanced Encryption Standard with 256-bit keys for storage and transport layer security for data moving across networks. Furthermore, access to this data repository must be governed by a strict model of role-based access control combined with multi-factor authentication. A frontline customer service representative does not need unrestricted access to the unencrypted passport scans of high-net-worth individuals, so the system must limit visibility to specialized compliance analysts. Implementing tokenization and pseudonymization techniques can further protect the database, ensuring that internal analytical tools process abstract tokens rather than exposing clear text identities. Automating record keeping through technology is the only viable way to maintain an audit-ready posture without drowning your operations in manual, error-prone workflows. When a regulatory auditor or a data protection inspector demands proof of compliance, you must be able to present a clear, immutable timeline of how a customer's data was processed. Automated platforms solve this by generating cryptographic audit logs that record every single instance of data access, modification, or external sharing. These logs must be tamper-evident, ensuring that no internal user, not even a system administrator, can alter the historical footprint of a compliance decision. By automating the tracking of data flows, an organization can instantly demonstrate exactly when an identity was verified, which external databases were queried, and when a specific file is scheduled for deletion. This programmatic visibility turns an audit from a chaotic, multi-week scramble into a predictable demonstration of architectural control. Handling individual data access requests in a globalized financial system introduces significant operational complexity that requires highly coordinated, automated workflows. Under modern privacy laws, individuals possess a clear legal right to demand a complete report detailing exactly what personal data an institution holds about them and how it is being utilized. When an organization receives a subject access request, the compliance system must extract all relevant information without accidentally exposing sensitive internal investigations or suspicious activity reports. If a customer has been flagged by an internal system, revealing that specific data to the individual during a privacy disclosure could constitute an illegal act of tipping off. Therefore, your retrieval mechanisms must be intelligent enough to segregate standard customer due diligence data from confidential regulatory filings. Designing a clear workflow that balances individual transparency with statutory confidentiality mandates ensures that your response fulfills data protection expectations while maintaining strict compliance with anti-money laundering secrecy laws. See you in the next lecture. Amicu poursuite. Hello and welcome back. As we look at the evolution of modern compliance, it becomes clear that manual verification methods are no longer sufficient to handle either the volume or the sophistication of current financial crime. Digital transformation within Know Your Customer protocols is not merely an operational upgrade. It is a fundamental shift toward automated, system-driven risk management. RegTech solutions now leverage electronic KYC tools to transform what used to be a fragmented, human-centric process into a deterministic workflow. When an organization transitions to digital identity verification, the goal is to systematically reduce operational friction while simultaneously tightening compliance gates. This means replacing physical passport inspections with automated document verification systems that utilize computer vision to detect microscopic anomalies in paper fibers, holographic overlays, and fonts. By processing these security features algorithmically, automated systems can catch sophisticated identity tampering that easily bypasses human eyes, effectively decoupling operational scaling from linear headcount growth. Fraud.net +1 At the center of this structural change sits artificial intelligence, specifically deployed for automated data matching across massive, distributed datasets. Traditional matching systems rely heavily on exact string alignment or rigid, predefined rules, which inevitably generate an overwhelming volume of false positives. AI-driven data matching introduces contextual analysis, using advanced algorithms to assess the semantic relationship between data entities, such as cross-referencing global corporate registers, sanctions list variations, and localized spelling nuances. This level of automation ensures that high-risk matches are surfaced instantly, allowing compliance analysts to bypass benign variations and focus exclusively on genuine anomalies. Furthermore, these systems are increasingly designed to counter synthetic identity fraud, a highly sophisticated threat vector where bad actors combine real and fabricated data points to build entirely fake credit and identity profiles. When an identity verification system analyzes a customer footprint, it can no longer just verify that a single government record exists. It must evaluate the entire historical and behavioral network context of that data to validate its legitimacy. NEODA's +1. However, introducing advanced machine learning models into your compliance architecture introduces a new engineering and regulatory challenge known as model risk. If a system automatically flags or rejects an individual, regulators expect the financial institution to demonstrate complete model governance and defensibility. You cannot treat an automated risk architecture as an uninterrogable black box, especially under modern legislative frameworks like the European Union AI Act. This requires the rigorous implementation of explainable AI techniques, such as applying feature attribution methods like local interpretable model-agnostic explanations or Shapley additive explanations to decode model decisions. When an algorithmic system generates a high-priority risk score, these technical frameworks isolate and rank the exact contributing factors, such as transaction velocity or geographic anomalies, providing a clear and traceable audit trail. Without this granular interpretability, a compliance department cannot justify its automated decisions during regulatory audits, leaving the institution exposed to substantial legal liabilities. TrackWiz +2. Beyond basic explainability, robust model governance demands proactive bias testing and systematic validation of the underlying code and training sets. Algorithms inherit the structural flaws and omissions present in the data used to train them, which means that uncalibrated risk models can accidentally produce systematically disparate outcomes across different geographic or demographic groups. To mitigate this algorithmic drift, compliance teams must establish strict statistical parity metrics, equal opportunity differences, and regular stress testing protocols to ensure fairness and consistency in automated grading. This continuous technical validation must always be paired with meaningful human oversight, maintaining a definitive human-in-the-loop framework for final, high-stakes judgments. Technology functions as an incredibly powerful force multiplier, providing the immense processing speed necessary to track illicit finance fragments across borders. But human accountability remains the anchor. By designing and maintaining automated tools that are both algorithmically sound and thoroughly auditable, a financial institution can build a defensible infrastructure that successfully repels sophisticated fraud while satisfying strict regulatory expectations. Encompass Corporation +1. See you in the next lecture. Hello and welcome back. When we design software systems, we often talk about establishing a known, deterministic baseline before introducing complex behavior. In the world of anti-money laundering compliance, standard customer due diligence operates on exactly the same principle. It serves as the non-negotiable architectural foundation for the vast majority of your customer interactions. We cannot safely evaluate anomalies or manage risks if we do not first establish a clear, verifiable definition of what constitutes normal, legitimate operations for a specific client. This baseline requires us to move beyond superficial data collection and systematically execute three explicit phases: establishing identity, verifying that identity against independent data, and understanding the true nature of the customer's intended business. Every financial institution must implement these steps systematically to satisfy both domestic statutory frameworks and international standards set by bodies like the Financial Action Task Force. The initial step in this process is data collection, which represents the formal declaration of identity by the customer. For natural persons, this phase demands specific, unambiguous attributes including the full legal name, the official date of birth, and the permanent residential address. When dealing with legal entities, the required surface area expands significantly to encompass the official corporate name, the unique registration number, the registered office address, and the names of the managing directors who govern the operation. You must treat this initial data as an unverified claim, a hypothesis that must be rigorously tested before any transaction capability is granted. Regulators explicitly prohibit institutions from establishing business relationships until this core identification data has been fully obtained. This structural constraint ensures that your system never processes unmapped or anonymous value flows, which are the primary vectors for financial crime. Verification is the process where we transform these unverified customer claims into objective, documented facts using reliable, independent sources. For individuals, this typically involves matching the provided data against government-issued photographic identification, such as a valid passport or a national driving license, ensuring that the document itself is authentic. For corporate entities, the verification architecture relies on official corporate registries, articles of association, or certificate of good standing obtained directly from public authorities. Nothing can be taken at face value during this phase, and standard compliance demands that these independent sources are entirely separate from the customer's own control. The goal is to establish structural certainty, confirming that the legal entity or natural person actually exists in the real world exactly as described. If the verification data contains unresolved discrepancies or fails to align with the initial claims, the onboarding pipeline must immediately stall. Understanding the nature and purpose of the business relationship is where we shift from static identity checks to dynamic behavioral modeling. We must explicitly ask the customer what they intend to do with the account, including the specific reasons they require our financial services. This means we must collect granular data regarding the types of financial products they intend to utilize, the geographic regions they will interact with, and the underlying economic reality of their profession or industry. A customer opening an account for domestic retail salary deposits presents a radically different operational profile compared to a corporate entity conducting import-export operations across multiple borders. By documenting the economic logic behind the relationship, we ensure that our compliance department understands precisely how the customer generates value. This contextual understanding prevents the institution from blindly executing transactions that lack genuine commercial utility or economic sense. A critical component of this behavioral modeling is the collection of explicit quantitative assessments regarding expected transaction volumes and values. We require the customer to estimate their anticipated monthly or annual turnover, the average size of individual transactions, and the frequency of their incoming and outgoing payments. This data allows us to construct a precise, mathematically rigorous behavioral baseline tailored specifically to that individual or entity. We are essentially defining the boundaries of expected execution, creating a reference model that our transaction monitoring systems can later use to detect statistical anomalies. If a client states they expect to process $5,000 monthly in local deposits, but suddenly receives a wire transfer for $50,000 from a foreign jurisdiction, the system flags the deviation. Without an initial baseline established during standard due diligence, our automated monitoring tools would lack the necessary telemetry to identify these critical warning signs. Ultimately, The success of your standard due diligence framework relies entirely on the quality and permanence of your audit trail. Compliance professionals must meticulously document the explicit reasons, the structural why, behind the creation of every single customer relationship. This documentation acts as a snapshot in time, capturing the exact state of the customer's risk profile, their verified credentials, and their stated operational expectations at the moment of onboarding. This historical record must be securely retained and made easily accessible for subsequent transaction monitoring cycles, periodic compliance reviews, and mandatory regulatory audits. When a financial investigator reviews an account 3 years after onboarding, they must be able to reconstruct the original compliance logic perfectly from the archive files. By enforcing rigid, disciplined documentation habits today, you build a resilient compliance infrastructure that can withstand intense scrutiny from international financial regulators. See you in the next lecture. Sanctions.io+3. Welcome back. In this lecture, we will examine the specific scenarios and structural conditions that require a compliance framework to transition from standard customer due diligence to enhanced due diligence. Standard customer due diligence operates under the assumption that a customer profile fits within a statistically predictable low to medium risk baseline, but this baseline breaks down when specific high-risk triggers are met. High-risk geographies present the most prominent trigger, typically defined by jurisdictions flagged by the Financial Action Task Force for strategic deficiencies in their anti-money laundering regimes or countries subject to international trade sanctions. Another critical trigger involves highly complex or opaque business structures, such as corporations utilizing multiple layers of shell companies, offshore trusts, or nominee shareholders that appear designed to obscure the identity of the ultimate beneficial owners. Cash-intensive industries, including casinos, money service businesses, and precious metal dealers, similarly trigger this elevated state because physical currency provides an inherent layer of anonymity that bypasses standard digital audit trails. When an automated risk engine or a manual reviewer identifies any of these operational parameters during onboarding or routine reassessment, the file must be systematically escalated. This systematic escalation ensures that the compliance infrastructure allocates its analytical resources proportionally to the severity of the threat exposure. The operational mechanics of enhanced due diligence dictate that the initial investigative scope must widen considerably beyond basic identity verification and corporate registry lookups. To execute this effectively, analysts must conduct exhaustive background checks that look into regulatory databases, specialized litigation history registries, and global adverse media archives. Relationship analysis becomes mandatory at this stage, requiring the compliance team to map out interconnected networks of subsidiaries, sister companies, close business associates, and any proxy relationships that could shield the true controllers of the assets. Furthermore, the temporal frequency of ongoing reviews must be fundamentally altered, compressing standard annual or biennial review cycles into semi-annual or even quarterly updates to catch behavioral shifts early. This expanded scrutiny is not merely a quantitative increase in the volume of data collected, but a qualitative shift toward analyzing the underlying logic of the customer's macroeconomic footprint. By cross-referencing industry norms against the client's stated corporate purpose, analysts can establish whether the proposed business relationship possesses a legitimate commercial rationale or a structural vulnerability. Navigating the legal and operational liabilities of high-risk profiles requires a strict governance protocol, which is why a compliance framework cannot permit the onboarding of these entities without formal senior management approval. This governance step serves as an essential internal control mechanism, decoupling the commercial pressure of business development from the risk appetite parameters established by the board of directors. Senior executives must review the aggregated investigation file, the documented risk rationale, and the proposed mitigation strategies before signing off on the relationship. If senior management grants approval, The onboarding team must systematically document the decision-making process within the client profile to ensure absolute accountability for potential future audits. Conversely, if the risk profile exceeds the institution's predefined thresholds, or if the customer fails to provide sufficient clarifying documentation during the escalation phase, the onboarding process must be halted and the relationship rejected. Establishing this clear boundary ensures that the compliance department operates as an objective, verifiable gatekeeper rather than a reactive administrative bottleneck. I look forward to discussing our next topic with you in the upcoming lecture. Hello, welcome back. When we design verification protocols for high-risk clients, we must maintain a clear distinction between the mechanisms that govern immediate financial transactions and those that explain a customer's total accumulation of assets over time. Source of funds refers specifically to the origin and the precise path of the assets or currency used to service a distinct transaction or business relationship. It answers the highly localized question of where the money for a particular deposit or investment came from, focusing on the immediate mechanism of transfer and the specific bank or asset type involved. Conversely, source of wealth describes the overarching economic, commercial, or business activities that generated the customer's entire net worth over their lifetime. To establish a reliable risk profile, an institution must look past the single transfer and construct an explanatory narrative regarding why and how the client amassed their total assets. If we fail to differentiate between these two vectors, our compliance model collapses because a legitimate bank transfer can easily mask an illegitimate origin of lifetime accumulation. To establish a defensible audit trail, a compliance officer must gather independent, reliable documents that act as cryptographic keys verifying the historical narrative presented by the client. For source of funds, we often look at highly immediate transactional artifacts like recent salary slips, formal asset sale agreements, or explicit inheritance documents accompanied by probate court confirmations. For source of wealth, the documentary requirements shift towards structural evidence, including multi-year personal tax returns, audited corporate financial records, or historical investment statements that show compounding capital gains over decades. We also utilize public company registries, commercial property deeds, and media archives to corroborate that a client's ownership stake in an enterprise aligns perfectly with public reality. If a client claims their wealth originates from a corporate divestment that occurred 10 years ago, we do not simply accept a written statement. We require the original bill of sale alongside bank statements tracking the historical flow of that capital. Each document collected must be critically evaluated for authenticity, logical consistency, and independence from the customer's unverified self-assertions. The real engineering challenge in enhanced due diligence lies in building a rigorous pattern-matching framework that identifies structural inconsistencies between a client's wealth profile and their reported income channels. We must systematically compare the client's observed net worth against what could reasonably be accumulated given their professional history, geographic market conditions, and demographic peers. For example, if an offshore beneficial owner claims an annual executive salary of $200,000 but controls a real estate portfolio valued at $30 million, the math simply does not balance. This massive delta indicates that other, unrecorded economic activities are driving the asset accumulation, which must immediately trigger an intensive, deep dive investigation. Compliance personnel must remain hypervigilant when checking high-risk profiles for these hidden anomalies, as they represent the primary indicators of potential layering and integration phases within laundering schemes. When the observed financial reality of a client outpaces their documented legal income streams, the compliance system must treat the profile as an active exception until every dollar can be explicitly accounted for. Our underlying strategy for resolving these exceptions relies on the classical principle of following the money, an operational methodology that demands a continuous, unbroken chain of custody from origin to current state. This principle dictates that an investigator cannot simply look at the endpoint of a transaction. They must map out each intermediate hop, corporate vehicle, and banking jurisdiction the capital traversed. By tracing the funds backwards through the financial system, we isolate the specific economic activities that breathed life into those assets, exposing any attempts to obfuscate ownership through shell companies or layer transfers. This rigorous tracking allows an institution to build a clear, rational hypothesis regarding the legitimacy of the wealth, rather than relying on superficial assumptions or blind trust. If a chain breaks or a chunk of the financial history becomes completely opaque due to uncooperative jurisdictions, the compliance framework must flag the asset flow as an unmitigated risk. Ultimately, following the money transforms an abstract, subjective assessment of a client's reputation into a factual, deterministic map of verifiable financial data. The ultimate purpose of maintaining this level of operational rigor is to ensure that the institution can clearly articulate its risk decisions during strict regulatory audits. When an external regulator reviews a high-risk client file, they will not judge the institution based on a vague feeling of safety. They will demand to see a clear, structured narrative explaining exactly why the wealth was deemed non-criminal. If the audit trail consists merely of a single unverified document and a generic sign-off from a relationship manager, the institution will face severe regulatory sanctions and massive compliance penalties. We must treat every customer file as if it will eventually be scrutinized by a hostile auditor under a microscope, which means our internal documentation must be completely self-explanatory and legally robust. Every conclusion reached by the compliance team regarding a politically exposed person or a high net worth individual must link directly back to an independent piece of evidence. By building this impenetrable wall of verified facts, the firm protects itself from legal liability and confirms that its anti-money laundering controls are operating as a highly effective shield. See you in the next lecture. Hello and welcome back. When we design software systems, we often discuss the pitfall of treating mutable state as if it were a static value. A similar fallacy exists in compliance architectures when an organization treats customer due diligence as a singular event completed at onboarding. In reality, a customer relationship is a continuous stream of behaviors and structural data, much like a stateful system that evolves over time. Ongoing monitoring is the mechanism by which we verify that our baseline assumptions about a customer remain valid throughout the entire operational lifecycle. If we fail to implement robust continuous verification, the data within our customer registry degrades, rendering our initial risk classifications obsolete. We must establish structured, predictable strategies to maintain a living, accurate representation of institutional risk without drowning the compliance team in manual labor. Automated transactional alerts serve as the primary sensory input for detecting shifts in a customer's operational behavior. These systems look at transaction velocity, volume, and frequency to identify deviations from the baseline established during onboarding. For instance, if a retail customer whose profile specifies a modest monthly salary suddenly receives multiple high-value international wires, the system generates an anomaly alert. These monitoring rules must also evaluate structural dimensions, such as product usage shifts or geographic exposure, such as a localized domestic business suddenly routing funds through a foreign jurisdiction with high financial crime risk. When an alert fires, it is not an immediate declaration of guilt, but rather a system event indicating that the customer's actual behavior has deviated from their declared intent. The compliance team must then investigate this delta to determine whether the transaction has a legitimate economic purpose or requires an escalation in risk status. While transactional alerts handle algorithmic deviations, certain critical events require what we call trigger-based reviews. A trigger-based review is an out-of-cycle assessment initiated by a material change in the customer's structural data or context, rather than a scheduled calendar date. Common administrative triggers include a significant change in ultimate beneficial ownership, an update to a corporate entity's legal status, or a sudden change in its physical operating location. Operational triggers can also stem from internal events, such as when a transactional alert cannot be easily cleared by an analyst, or external signals, like the discovery of negative media regarding an executive. For example, if a corporate client restructures and transfers 25% or more of its shares to an entity registered in a secrecy haven, that structural mutation must immediately halt normal processing and force a comprehensive reassessment of the customer's risk profile. To manage these continuous streams of alerts and triggers effectively, financial institutions must design efficient review cycles that carefully balance resources with risk exposure. It is operationally impossible and economically unfeasible to review every customer file with equal intensity on a monthly basis, which is why we apply a disciplined, risk-based approach. High-risk customers might require a comprehensive, automated review every quarter, medium-risk accounts annually, and low-risk profiles every 2 or 3 years. Modern architectures are increasingly moving toward perpetual client verification, where automated data pipelines continuously pull updates from corporate registries and watch lists to calculate risk scores in real time. By automating the collection of routine data and reserving manual human analysis for complex, flagged anomalies, an institution can maintain a current and defensible view of its entire customer base. This ensures that the organization remains both compliant with regulatory mandates and structurally efficient over the long haul. See you in the next lecture. Hello, and welcome back. When we evaluate a client, we cannot rely solely on structured data, such as passports, utility bills, or corporate registries. A company might have pristine registration documents while simultaneously being investigated for bribing foreign officials. This is where adverse media screening enters our workflow as a critical component of customer due diligence. Adverse media refers to any negative information found in public sources, including news reports, regulatory bulletins, and legal filings, that links a prospective or existing customer to financial crime. Incorporating this screening into our process allows us to look beyond formal declarations and assess the real-world behavioral risks associated with a relationship. Ultimately, our goal is to identify potential red flags before they manifest as actual compliance failures within our infrastructure. To effectively manage this aspect of due diligence, we must understand the direct correlation between negative public information and institutional risk. Reputational risk is not a vague or purely public relations concern. It represents the quantifiable danger that negative public perception will lead to a loss of institutional value, regulatory penalties, or a decline in the customer base. When a financial institution maintains a relationship with an individual or entity accused of money laundering, environmental crime, or corruption, the public and regulators view that association as tacit approval or systemic negligence. This erosion of public trust can trigger immediate financial consequences, such as severe regulatory fines, a collapse in counterparty relationships, or the withdrawal of investor capital. Therefore, we treat adverse media screening not as a decorative addition to our compliance checklist, but as a vital defensive mechanism designed to insulate our business from criminal elements and preserve institutional integrity. A systematic screening process requires us to gather data from a diverse array of unstructured sources, ranging from traditional news outlets to localized regulatory bulletins. We actively monitor reputable international journalistic platforms, domestic news feeds, and specialized industry publications to capture broad trends and specific legal actions. Additionally, official bulletins from bodies like the Financial Crime Enforcement Network, the Financial Conduct Authority, or regional law enforcement agencies provide highly reliable indicators of pending investigations. While social media signals can occasionally serve as an early warning system for fast-moving events, they present a significantly higher volume of unverified assertions. We treat raw social media data with extreme caution, utilizing it primarily as a prompt to search for corroborating evidence in formal channels rather than using it as a standalone basis for a risk assessment. By casting a wide but structured net across these channels, we ensure that our risk model captures local legal disputes and global financial scandals alike. The primary operational challenge in adverse media screening is distinguishing between credible reporting and ambient noise. To evaluate the reliability of a source, we must systematically assess its independence, track record, and institutional backing. A peer-reviewed investigative report or an article from an established global financial publication carries substantially more weight than an anonymous blog post or a politically motivated local news outlet. We also look for corroboration across multiple independent networks to minimize the risk of relying on a single biased account. Furthermore, we must evaluate the specificity and context of the allegations, checking whether the report details precise transactions, dates, and legal charges, or if it merely relies on vague associations. If a news report lacks verifiable evidence or stems from a source with a known history of sensationalism, we record it as low credibility noise, whereas an indictment announced by a prosecutor constitutes a highly credible signal that requires immediate action. Once we identify a credible piece of adverse media, we must document our assessment meticulously to ensure that our decision-making process is transparent and reproducible. Every finding requires a clear entry in the client file detailing the specific nature of the allegations, the source material, and our evaluation of its credibility. We record the exact date the information was published, the specific entities or individuals named, and how closely connected they are to our customer, such as a direct match versus a parent company link. Our documentation must explicitly outline the logic behind our risk determination, explaining why a particular report either alters the client's risk profile or why it was deemed immaterial. This audit trail is indispensable because it proves to internal auditors and external regulators that the institution acted with due diligence and did not ignore public warnings. A poorly documented file is, from a regulatory standpoint, functionally equivalent to an unperformed screening. Not all negative news requires the same operational response, so we must establish clear protocols for when to initiate a formal escalation or terminate a relationship. When an assessment reveals that a client is under active indictment for fraud, money laundering, or sanctions evasion, our standard procedure dictates a formal escalation to the Senior Compliance Committee. This escalation involves a holistic review of the client's historical transaction patterns, current asset balances, and the expected trajectory of the legal proceedings. If the risk is deemed unmanageable, or if the allegations align directly with core financial crimes, the compliance team must systematically execute a relationship termination protocol. This process involves freezing or closing accounts in accordance with local regulations and ensuring that the exit is handled without tipping off the client if a suspicious activity report is warranted. Managing these boundaries carefully allows us to protect the institution from criminal exposure while avoiding unnecessary disruption to legitimate business operations. Until next time, goodbye. Hello, and welcome back. When a regulator or an independent auditor walks into your institution, they do not care about your good intentions, your professional intuition, or what your memory tells you happened 6 months ago. Regulators value verifiable evidence over subjective intent, meaning that an undocumented compliance action simply did not happen in their eyes. This brings us to the core discipline of creating and managing comprehensive, audit-ready files that can withstand intense legal and regulatory scrutiny. A robust audit trail must meticulously document every single decision made during the customer onboarding and review processes, providing a clear chronological narrative. This means you must record the exact rationale behind every assigned risk classification, explicitly stating why a client was deemed low, medium, or high risk. Furthermore, you must permanently preserve the results of all sanctions, politically exposed persons, and adverse media screenings, including the clear justification for dismissing any false positives. Your digital file should be structured systematically, utilizing consistent naming conventions and predictable folder hierarchies so they are easily navigable by external auditors or law enforcement. By establishing an evidence-first culture within your team, you protect the financial firm from catastrophic fines and safeguard your personal professional liability as a compliance officer. Let us examine the mechanics of structuring these digital files to ensure they serve as a bulletproof narrative. An auditor should be able to pick up a customer file and reconstruct the entire lifetime of that relationship without needing to interview the analyst who worked on it. Every document, from the initial corporate registry extract to the final beneficial ownership declaration, requires clear indexing and date stamping. When an analyst escalates a high-risk file, the system must log not just the decision, but the specific attributes that triggered the escalation, such as a complex ownership structure involving a secrecy jurisdiction. If you use automated screening software, you must archive the specific version of the screening database used at that exact moment in time, as sanctions lists change daily. If an auditor cannot verify the exact state of the sanctions list on the day you onboarded a client, your screening process is effectively unprovable. Therefore, a definitive audit trail requires capturing the raw data inputs, the processing logic applied by your systems, and the final human evaluation in a unified, unalterable digital format. To illustrate this in practice, consider a scenario where your firm decides to onboard a corporate client from a jurisdiction frequently associated with higher corruption risks. The analyst performs enhanced due diligence, uncovers the complex layer of offshore holding companies, and correctly identifies the ultimate beneficial owners. However, if the file merely contains the certificates of incorporation without a written narrative explaining how the analyst traced the ownership structure, the audit trail is broken. You must include a signed memorandum or an immutable system note detailing the step-by-step verification process, explicitly linking the evidence gathered to the final risk assessment. If you decide that the client's source of wealth is legitimate based on a specific corporate sale, you must attach the contract or audited financial statements that validate that specific transaction. Conversely, if you screen a client and find a matching name on a sanctions list, your file must document the precise birth date or nationality check that proved it was a false positive. Leaving a screening alert marked as closed without an explicit, data-backed explanation creates an immediate red flag for any regulatory examiner. We must also address the common pitfalls in documentation that frequently lead to severe regulatory enforcement actions. The most pervasive vulnerability in compliance files is the complete absence of formal senior management approvals for high-risk customers or politically exposed persons. Another frequent failure point is the presence of outdated verification records, where a client's risk profile has shifted over time, but the underlying documentation remains static from 5 years prior. Compliance teams often fall into the trap of using vague, non-committal language in their rationales, writing phrases like "client seems reputable" instead of citing specific, verified corporate registries or audited statements. Furthermore, failing to log the exact date and time when ongoing monitoring alerts were reviewed can destroy the chronological integrity of your audit trail. When an enforcement agency reviews your files, these gaps look less like simple administrative oversight and more like deliberate negligence or a systemic failure of your compliance program. You can mitigate these structural risks by implementing automated mandatory fields within your compliance software, preventing an analyst from closing a file until all required sign-offs and rationales are hard-coded into the system ledger. Ultimately, maintaining a strict culture of evidence-first documentation is your strongest shield during external scrutiny or enforcement actions. When a regulatory body launches an investigation into an institutional failure, the compliance officer is often the individual placed under the microscope. If your files demonstrate a consistent, disciplined adherence to documented policies, showing that every risk-based decision was backed by contemporaneous evidence. The firm can successfully defend its compliance program. A well-maintained audit trail proves that your compliance framework is an active, operational reality rather than just a theoretical policy document gathering dust on a shelf. This level of defensive documentation requires continuous vigilance and an uncompromising refusal to accept shortcuts, ensuring that no client relationship moves forward without its corresponding digital proof. By treating the audit trail as a core product of your daily operations rather than a secondary administrative chore, you build a resilient environment where compliance decisions are transparent, repeatable, and completely defensible. Thank you for your time, and I will see you in the next lecture. Hello, and welcome back. When we design anti-money laundering monitoring systems, we often focus on automated thresholds, much like a developer relies on unit tests to catch regression bugs. However, relying solely on static rules is a fragile architecture because financial criminals are adaptive actors who intentionally obfuscate their structural patterns to exploit system parameters. To build a robust defense, you must train your analytical eye to look beyond the raw numbers and recognize behavioral triggers, which serve as the implicit contract violations of financial crime. Identifying suspicious activity requires both an art and a science, blending explicit transactional data with the subtler contextual patterns that deviate from expected business norms. In this lecture, we will look at behavioral red flags, including structuring tactics, rapid velocity of funds, unexplained variance in historical account usage, and logical flaws in customer metadata. By training your compliance operations to observe these behavioral signals early, your institution can intercept illicit activity before it translates into systematic regulatory failure or significant financial liability. The most common manifestation of intentional evasion is structuring, frequently implemented through an operational methodology known as smuffing. In a typical structuring scenario, an actor deliberately fragments a conspicuously large sum of cash into multiple smaller deposits to remain safely below statutory currency transaction reporting thresholds, which are usually set at $10,000. For instance, instead of depositing $30,000 in a single transparent interaction, a courier might execute 5 distinct deposits of $6,000 at different branches or over consecutive business days. Smuffing scales this operational complexity by deploying multiple low-skill couriers or money mules to distribute these sub-threshold deposits across a wider web of disconnected accounts and geographic locations. When you analyze these interactions in isolation, each transaction appears entirely benign and fails to trigger traditional rule-based alerts. True detection requires a shift toward holistic pattern analysis, aggregating these fragmented data points over time to expose the coordinated, artificial design of the underlying placement strategy. Another critical behavioral trigger is the rapid movement of funds, a pattern that frequently signals the layering phase of money laundering where actors attempt to break the audit trail. In a legitimate financial life cycle, capital typically resides within an account to accrue interest, fund operational expenses, or facilitate planned commercial investments. When you observe funds being deposited and then almost immediately routed out via domestic wires, international remittances, or crypto asset transfers without any clear commercial rationale, the account is functioning as a temporary conduit rather than a store of value. This high transactional velocity is engineered specifically to outrun the processing latency of compliance investigations and distance the fund from their illicit origin. The absence of an underlying business purpose becomes even more apparent when the inbound funds are aggregated from multiple sources and subsequently consolidated into a single outbound transfer to a high-risk jurisdiction. This behavior is a structural anomaly that should immediately prompt a deeper investigation into the economic reality of the relationship. To effectively differentiate between normal customer behavior and a true behavioral red flag, you must always evaluate transaction patterns against the baseline established by the customer's known business profile. A sudden, unexplained variance in account activity, such as a long-dormant personal account abruptly processing high-volume commercial receipts, represents a significant mutation in the risk profile. When an individual with a documented low-income profile begins receiving or transferring thousands of dollars multiple times a week, the numbers simply do not align with the established metadata. Compliance operations must look past the superficial mechanics of the transaction and explicitly ask whether the volume, frequency, and nature of the financial flow make logical sense for that specific entity. If a local retail business with purely domestic operations starts executing complex international trade-based transactions, the invariant of their business model has been breached. Comparing actual transactional behavior against expected peer group norms allows you to spot these subtle variations before they cause broader compliance issues. Finally, we must pay close attention to inconsistencies in the qualitative information provided by the customer during onboarding or ongoing monitoring updates. When a client provides vague, evasive, or conflicting explanations regarding the source of their wealth, or when their physical documentation shows minor structural anomalies, these are clear behavioral warnings. Sophisticated money laundering schemes often rely on shell companies with complex ownership webs that serve no legitimate operational purpose other than to mask the identity of the ultimate beneficial owners. Mismatched personal information across verification documents, or the reuse of shared contact infrastructure like phone numbers and addresses across seemingly unrelated accounts, points to an intentional effort to deceive. Automated transaction monitoring is highly effective for detecting blatant threshold breaches, but it cannot replace human judgment when evaluating whether a customer's narrative aligns with reality. By looking at both the transactional velocity and the behavioral consistency of the client, you create a multi-layered compliance framework that is resilient against evolving financial crime strategies. See you in the next lecture. Hello, and welcome back. When we analyze transactional anomalies, we must transition from a subjective understanding of human behavior to a structured, data-driven methodology. Data analysis serves as the backbone of transaction monitoring because manual oversight cannot scale to handle millions of transactions across global networks. At a fundamental level, financial institutions deploy monitoring software that flags deviations from an established baseline of normal activity. This baseline is defined using historical consumer data, peer group comparison, and fixed regulatory parameters. If a customer typically transfers small sums locally and suddenly initiates large international wires, the system registers a variance. However, data analysis goes deeper than tracking simple differences by looking for specific operational signatures that match known laundering patterns. We must treat these transactional logs as systems telemetry, evaluating incoming events against specific thresholds to determine if the financial infrastructure is being manipulated. The goal is to isolate high-risk patterns without disrupting legitimate commerce, a task that requires an understanding of underlying triggers. Velocity and volume triggers serve as the primary programmatic mechanisms for identifying transactional spikes. A velocity trigger monitors the speed or frequency of transactions within a defined time window, searching for rapid asset movement that indicates structural layering. For example, if an account receives 10 rapid-fire deposits from separate automated clearinghouse sources and immediately routes the aggregated sum out via a single wire transfer within 2 hours, a velocity trigger trips. Volume triggers, on the other hand, focus strictly on the cumulative monetary amount or the raw quantity of transactions, regardless of temporal density. A classic example involves an account that systematically keeps transactions just under the reporting threshold of $10,000, a technique known as smoothing or structuring. By writing systems rules that look at the total monthly volume or flags repeated transactions at $9,900, we capture anomalies that bypass basic point-of-sale limits. Calibrating these triggers requires continuous data regression to ensure they catch true suspicious activity without generating immense operational friction. System calibration represents a critical operational trade-off between sensitivity and specificity within automated compliance systems. If you configure your monitoring rules too strictly, the system generates an overwhelming number of false positives, which dilute compliance resources and cause analyst burnout. Conversely, if you loosen the parameters too much to lower the alert volume, you increase the risk of false negatives, allowing actual money laundering to pass undetected. To achieve proper calibration, compliance officers must periodically perform tuning exercises, reviewing historical alert data to calculate the conversion rate of alerts to actual suspicious activity reports. If a specific velocity rule triggers 1,000 alerts but yields 0 regulatory filings, that rule requires recalibration because its threshold is decoupled from actual risk. We use statistical analysis, such as looking at standard deviations from median customer activity, to set dynamic thresholds that adjust to shifting economic realities. A well-calibrated system ensures that investigators only spend time analyzing data points that possess a high probability of representing illicit financial flows. Examining specific money laundering typologies helps ground these automated rules in real-world scenarios. Consider crypto-adjacent fraud, where traditional bank accounts are used as off-ramps or on-ramps for unregulated digital asset exchanges. The transactional anomaly here often presents as a sudden influx of high-volume, low-value wires from diverse retail accounts, followed immediately by large lump-sum transfers to known cryptocurrency exchange settlement accounts. In trade-based money laundering, the anomalies shift from digital velocity to structural inconsistencies between financial documentation and physical realities. Here, an analyst might notice an account executing complex wire transfers to foreign exporters where the stated value of the goods significantly exceeds the market price, or where the shipping documentation lists goods entirely unrelated to the business's core operational profile. These complex wire transfers frequently involve shell companies situated in secrecy jurisdictions, utilizing nested correspondent banking relationships to obscure the ultimate origin of the funds. When we analyze these multi-legged transactions, we look for round-tripping, where funds leave an entity and return to the same ecosystem through a circuitous path. The ultimate responsibility for interpreting these automated alerts and complex typologies rests entirely with the compliance officer. A system alert is merely a data point indicating a deviation. It does not constitute proof of financial crime. The compliance officer must conduct a structured investigation, gathering context by reviewing customer due diligence files, verifying the source of funds, and reaching out to operational teams for business justifications. You must determine whether the anomalous activity crosses the threshold into a reasonable suspicion of illicit behavior, which necessitates a formal regulatory filing. This decision requires a defensive, evidence-based approach where every conclusion is documented meticulously within the case management system. If an anomaly can be reasonably explained by a legitimate, verified business transition, the alert can be cleared with a documented rationale. However, if the transaction patterns lack economic logic, mismatch the client's risk profile, or involve uncooperative counterparties, the compliance officer must escalate the event. Your analytical rigor during this investigative phase directly dictates the institution's regulatory compliance and exposure to legal liability. Until next time, goodbye. Hello, and welcome back. We are moving forward in our exploration of internal systems, focusing now on the operational mechanics required when an investigation confirms your suspicions. When your transaction monitoring or enhanced due diligence workflows confirm that an anomaly cannot be validated by legitimate business logic, You cross the threshold from observation to a legal mandate. This transition requires the creation and submission of a suspicious activity report, commonly known as SAR. The regulatory framework imposes strict temporal constraints on this process, demanding that a completed report be submitted to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, or FinCEN, within 30 calendar days from the date of initial detection. If your investigative team is unable to identify a specific suspect during this primary window, the law permits an extension of an additional 30 days, bringing the absolute boundary to 60 calendar days. It is a common misconception that the clock begins when the Compliance Committee formally votes to file. In reality, federal examiners measure the deadline from the exact day the initial alert or red flag was uncovered. Failing to adhere to this timeline exposes the financial institution to severe civil monetary penalties and systemic regulatory failures. A high-quality filing depends entirely on your ability to structure data so that federal investigators can ingest and act upon it without friction. The document is divided into discrete, highly structured sections alongside a free text narrative that serves as the core of the report. You must comprehensively populate the standardized fields regarding subject identification, which includes full legal names, tax identification numbers, verified addresses, and occupations. Reusing existing data from your Know Your Customer profiles is necessary, but you must ensure that the specific dates and precise dollar amounts of the suspicious transactions are isolated and highlighted. The structural components must detail the exact mechanisms used to move the illicit capital, explicitly indicating whether the activity involved wire transfers, structured cash deposits, or foreign exchange instruments. Law enforcement agencies rely on database queries that parse these specific fields, meaning that typographical errors or omissions directly undermine the utility of the entire filing. While the structured fields provide the necessary metadata, the narrative section is where your compliance team must demonstrate analytical rigor. An effective narrative does not simply restate the numbers. It tells a complete and logical story by addressing the 5 core questions of who, what, when, where, and why. You should establish the normal historical baseline of the customer relationship first, and then explicitly contrast that baseline with the observed transactional anomalies. The tone of this writing must remain strictly objective, professional, and devoid of emotional language, speculation, or unsupported accusations. Instead of writing that a client appeared defensive or untrustworthy, you must state the factual events chronologically, such as noting that the client structured multiple cash deposits exactly at $9,900 over consecutive business days. Clarity and conciseness ensure that FinCEN reviewers can quickly grasp the specific money laundering typology being executed without wading through irrelevant conversational fluff. Beyond the mechanics of drafting the report lies a strict legal boundary that governs how your institution interacts with the client under investigation. Federal law enforces an absolute rule of confidentiality regarding the existence of SAR, meaning that notifying any suspect or third party that an investigation is underway is a federal crime. This illicit disclosure is known as tipping off, and violating this prohibition carries severe criminal penalties, including heavy personal fines and potential imprisonment for the compliance officer involved. Maintaining this standard requires an intentional separation between your automated transaction monitoring team and your customer-facing staff who manage daily accounts. If a client asks why their accounts are frozen or why certain transactions are delayed during an active review, your staff must use pre-approved, neutral operational responses without dropping any hints. You must treat the entire investigative lifecycle as an isolated environment, ensuring that internal documentation, case files, and submitted reports are protected from unauthorized internal or external eyes. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. We are moving our focus to an operational reality that demands absolute precision, namely the strict requirement of federal law to preserve the complete secrecy of suspicious activity reports. When your compliance system flags a transaction and triggers a filing, the machinery of justice relies entirely on the target remaining completely unaware of that fact. The regulatory framework leaves zero room for error or ambiguity here, meaning that any failure to maintain this boundary is treated as a major violation of law. If an investigator or an employee compromises this barrier, the legal and operational survival of the financial institution itself is immediately placed at risk. Our goal is to understand exactly how to construct airtight internal boundaries so that the existence of a report never leaks to the outside world. To understand the gravity of this requirement, we must first look at the legal consequences defined under the Bank Secrecy Act and enforced by bodies like the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Violating the absolute prohibition against disclosing a report, or even revealing any information that would imply a report exists, carries heavy civil money penalties that can easily reach $100,000 per violation. On the criminal side, an individual employee who leaks this information faces up to $500,000 in fines and a corporate prison sentence of up to 5 years. These penalties are not abstract regulatory threats. They're actively applied because a single leak can completely destroy a federal investigation, endanger law enforcement personnel, and allow illicit funds to vanish instantly. The law describes this specific breach of confidentiality as tipping off, and it represents a point of absolute failure for any anti-money laundering program. Preventing a tip-off requires a highly restricted internal communication protocol built entirely around a strict need-to-know architectural principle. Within your institution, knowledge that a report has been drafted or submitted must be completely segregated from standard operational visibility, limiting exposure solely to the anti-money laundering compliance team and senior legal officers. Your database infrastructure must reflect this design by utilizing role-based access controls, advanced data encryption at rest and in transit, and immutable access logs that track every single instance a file is viewed. Standard customer relationship management software or client notes must never contain phrases like report filed, compliance review, or suspicious activity detected. If a branch employee or account manager can open a client profile and see that an investigation is pending, your internal controls have already failed, and your institution is exposed to catastrophic regulatory liability. The ultimate test of your confidentiality framework occurs when a customer explicitly contacts the firm to demand an explanation for a delayed or blocked transaction. In these moments, customer-facing staff experience intense pressure to provide answers, yet they must navigate the conversation without dropping even the slightest hint about compliance intervention. The standard operating procedure here is to rely strictly on neutral, non-committal language that attributes the delay to standard operational reviews, temporary system processing holds, or missing transactional documentation. If a transaction is legally frozen due to a pending regulatory response, employees must firmly redirect the client to formal customer service channels without improvising or panicking. Training your frontline personnel to maintain this calm, scripted neutrality is the only way to successfully protect the integrity of a state investigation while simultaneously shielding your institution from immense legal peril. See you in the next lecture. Hello, and welcome back to the course. Today we shift our focus inward to examine a critical vulnerability that many organizations overlook until it is too late. When we design and implement anti-money laundering controls, we naturally treat the external customer as the primary source of risk. This perspective, while intuitive, introduces a dangerous blind spot because a compliance system is only as reliable as the human actors who execute it. Internal threats represent a severe systemic risk because a compromised employee possesses the precise knowledge required to circumvent the exact know-your-customer controls they are paid to enforce. We see this manifest when an insider intentionally facilitates financial crime, perhaps by manually overriding system alerts, ignoring blatant discrepancies in identity documents, or deliberately misclassifying a high-risk entity to avoid triggering enhanced due diligence. Furthermore, the risk extends beyond active collusion to passive complicity, such as when staff members access unauthorized client accounts out of curiosity or convenience, inadvertently exposing sensitive credentials that external bad actors can later exploit. A single accomplice inside the firm can systematically dismantle the integrity of your entire transaction monitoring framework by introducing clean capital or masking illicit trails before the data ever reaches the automated compliance engine. To mitigate this architectural vulnerability, a resilient compliance framework must incorporate rigorous structural guardrails that do not rely purely on individual honesty. The most fundamental of these mechanisms is independent oversight, which dictates that no single employee should have autonomous control over high-risk compliance decisions. In practice, this is achieved by implementing the four eyes principle, operational control requiring that any critical action, such as onboarding a politically exposed person or clearing a high-value sanctions alert, must be reviewed and approved by a second, independent pair of eyes. This separation of duties ensures that even if one internal actor becomes compromised, they cannot unilaterally execute a fraudulent override without the active collusion of a peer. Additionally, robust technical audit trails must capture every manual modification, account access, and alert dismissal, allowing independent compliance auditors to reconstruct employee behavior retroactively. Without these systemic checks and balances, an organization grants unmonitored administrative power to individuals, transforming the compliance department itself into a high-risk vector for regulatory failure. Detecting internal misconduct requires a culture where observations can be securely escalated without fear of retaliation, which is why a formalized whistleblower program is non-negotiable. Employees on the front lines are often the first to notice anomalous behavior, such as a colleague consistently processing transactions for specific clients outside of standard operating hours or repeatedly bypassing established documentation protocols. When these indicators arise, the firm must provide a clear, anonymous, and legally protected reporting channel that bypasses the traditional management hierarchy. The mechanics of reporting internal threats must be explicitly defined within your internal policies, ensuring that investigations are handled by an independent internal affairs or specialized compliance unit. Crucially, the standard of scrutiny applied during these investigations must be absolute and blind to organizational hierarchy. Whether the suspicious behavior involves an entry-level clerk or a high-ranking executive managing a lucrative corporate account, the compliance program must hold all staff to the identical level of accountability to preserve the firm's legal and ethical integrity. Thank you for your time, and I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome back. We are looking at what happens immediately after a suspicious activity report leaves your hands. A common misconception in compliance work is that submitting a regulatory filing marks the end of a particular process. In reality, submittal represents a transition into a long-term phase of structured retention and potential secondary inquiry. You are legally required to retain all documentation supporting that specific filing for a minimum of 5 years from the date of the submission. This is not merely an internal policy recommendation, but a strict regulatory mandate designed to ensure that an audit trail remains completely intact for future law enforcement scrutiny. The supporting documentation includes every transactional ledger, email exchange, verification check, and internal memo that contributed to the determination that an activity was suspicious. These pieces of evidence must be archived in a manner that preserves their integrity and guarantees they are secure yet readily accessible to authorized investigators. If an institution fails to produce these documents upon a legitimate law enforcement request, it faces severe regulatory penalties irrespective of how thorough the initial filing was. Therefore, your record-keeping architecture must be robust enough to withstand rigorous legal and regulatory evaluations years after the file is technically closed. Filing a report frequently acts as a trigger for subsequent, targeted requests from law enforcement agencies seeking to expand their investigations. A primary mechanism for this interaction in the United States is the USA Patriot Act Section 314 request process, which enables authorities to query financial institutions regarding accounts held by suspected illicit actors. When your institution receives a 314 list, you are required to conduct a thorough, expedited search across all your data systems to identify matches. If you find a match for an entity that was the subject of your recent filing, you must handle this information with extreme care to maintain systemic integrity. Law enforcement might follow up with subpoenas or formal requests for the underlying documentation you archived during your retention process. It is vital to understand that while a standard 314 request requires you to report the existence of an account, it does not automatically authorize you to hand over files without proper legal instruments like a grand jury subpoena. Your internal procedures must clearly delineate how to respond to these distinct levels of legal inquiry without inadvertently violating privacy laws or compromising ongoing investigations. Beyond external communication, the act of filing must fundamentally alter how your organization views that specific customer from a risk management perspective. A filing serves as definitive empirical evidence that the client's actual behavior has deviated significantly from their expected transactional profile. Consequently, you must immediately reevaluate and update the client's risk classification within your compliance framework, usually elevating them to the highest risk tier. This reclassification triggers a comprehensive review of the entire business relationship to determine whether maintaining it poses an unacceptable level of regulatory or reputational danger. Terminating a relationship is not an automated consequence of a filing, as abruptly closing an account can sometimes tip off the suspect and disrupt an active law enforcement operation. The decision to maintain or terminate must be a deliberate, documented choice made by a committee or senior compliance officer who weighs defensive risk management against potential investigative interference. If you choose to keep the account open, you must apply stringent, continuous monitoring protocols to track every subsequent transaction with heightened scrutiny. Every decision made during this post-filing evaluation phase must be explicitly recorded to prove to auditors that your institution exercised due diligence and maintained strict accountability. See you in the next lecture. Hello, and welcome back. When an organization expands its operations beyond a single territory, it immediately confronts a significant architectural problem: the friction between centralized policy and localized execution. In the domain of anti-money laundering compliance, this friction manifests as cross-border jurisdictional variance. We cannot simply assume that a Know Your Customer framework designed for one country will function legally or effectively in another. Financial crime operates globally, utilizing interconnected systems, yet our regulatory obligations remain strictly bound to sovereign borders. To build a robust compliance posture, we must systematically analyze how global standards interact with local legislation and design systems that accommodate these differences without collapsing into unmanageable complexity. The Financial Action Task Force, or FATF, provides the baseline architecture for international compliance through its recommendations. These guidelines, such as Recommendation 16 concerning cross-border payment transparency, establish the minimum data payloads that must accompany transactions. However, the FATF is not a legislature. Its recommendations only gain teeth when codified by individual nations. This codification is rarely uniform. For instance, the implementation thresholds, enforcement intensity, and specific interpretations of what constitutes an intermediary service provider differ across regions. A firm operating internationally must treat FATF guidelines as an abstract interface, while recognizing that the concrete implementations will vary by host country. Relying solely on a global baseline leaves the organization exposed to severe local regulatory sanctions. To manage this variance, your risk assessment methodology must separate global systemic risk from local operational risk. A global risk assessment identifies broad threats across the entire enterprise, establishing a unified risk scoring taxonomy. This ensures that a high-risk client profile is recognized consistently whether they attempt to onboard in London, Singapore, or New York. Conversely, a local risk assessment focuses on the specific regulatory realities of a single jurisdiction, such as domestic tax evasion typologies or localized terrorist financing threats. The system design must allow local entities to override or escalate risk classifications based on local mandates, without breaking the integrity of the global data model. You must ensure that the centralized compliance function maintains visibility over these local adjustments to prevent dangerous visibility silos. The structural design of an international compliance framework becomes even more difficult when we consider data sovereignty. Data sovereignty is the legal principle that digital data is subject to the laws of the country in which it is physically located or processed. When transferring customer identification data across borders for centralized screening, you often run directly into strict data protection laws like the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation. While anti-money laundering rules demand transparency and data sharing, privacy laws demand data minimization and localization. To resolve this conflict, a compliance framework must incorporate sophisticated technical and contractual safeguards. This includes deploying privacy-enhancing technologies like data pseudonymization, utilizing binding corporate rules, and maintaining exhaustive audit trails to prove that every cross-border transfer is legally authorized. Finally, your compliance framework must include active mechanisms for monitoring jurisdictional divergence in sanctions and enforcement. Sanctions lists are highly political and shift rapidly. A country or individual blocked by one jurisdiction may remain entirely legal to transact with in another. If your system relies on a single, static global filter, you risk either violating local laws or turning away legitimate business unnecessarily. Your monitoring infrastructure must therefore track legislative changes in real time, enabling dynamic rule adjustments across your screening engines. Operational consistency across borders is achieved not by forcing an identical process everywhere, but by building an adaptable system that enforces the highest global standard while respecting local legal constraints. Goodbye, and I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome back. Let us consider how we manage the specific systemic risks introduced by the growth of crypto-adjacent exposure. The rise of virtual assets introduces structural complexities that standard compliance workflows are rarely equipped to handle. Traditional money laundering typologies rely on central clearers and recognizable institutional friction points, but crypto assets alter this dynamic by allowing near-instantaneous cross-border value movement. When an entity transfers value across distributed ledgers, the speed of execution completely bypasses the traditional window required for standard transactional interventions. Furthermore, the ecosystem is heavily reliant on anonymous, self-hosted wallets where ownership is established purely by cryptographic private keys rather than verified legal identities. This architecture makes it remarkably simple for bad actors to obscure the ultimate destination of funds before a traditional institution even registers the initial deposit. Compliance teams must recognize that this velocity and structural anonymity require a fundamentally different approach to real-time risk assessment. A significant vector of this emerging threat landscape stems from interactions with decentralized finance, commonly known as DeFi protocols. Unlike centralized exchanges that operate with a recognizable corporate hierarchy, DeFi protocols rely on autonomous smart contracts that execute logic without human or institutional intermediaries. This permissionless structure allows illicit actors to engage in automated token swapping, yield farming, and liquidity provisioning completely outside the perimeter of conventional onboarding controls. By interacting with these protocols, users can rapidly layer transactions, effectively dismantling the audit trail that traditional due diligence processes expect to find. To counter this, financial institutions must view any direct or indirect interaction with decentralized applications as an explicit trigger for heightened scrutiny. It is no longer sufficient to merely monitor the direct counterparty. You must understand the underlying smart contracts they interact with. To establish regulatory clarity across these decentralized networks, the Financial Action Task Force introduced specific guidance, universally implemented as the Travel Rule under Recommendation 16. The core operational mandate of the Travel Rule requires both originating and beneficiary financial institutions, alongside virtual asset service providers, to collect and securely transmit accurate sender and recipient information during virtual asset transfers. Specifically, institutions must exchange the originator's legal name, account or wallet address, and physical address or national identity number, alongside the beneficiary's name and ledger location. In jurisdictions like the European Union, regulations enforce a strict zero-threshold policy for inter-crypto service provider transfers, meaning this data must travel with every single transaction regardless of the fiat value. For self-hosted wallet interactions, stricter protocols dictate that transfers exceeding €1,000 require formal cryptographic ownership verification of that external wallet. Integrating these digital currency realities into your firm's existing anti-money laundering framework requires the systematic application of risk-based onboarding and monitoring strategies. Financial institutions must actively screen and categorize counterparty virtual asset service providers, explicitly identifying and flagging high-risk, non-compliant exchanges that operate in loose regulatory jurisdictions or fail to enforce proper customer identification procedures. Transaction monitoring systems must also be recalibrated to detect structured crypto transactions, which often present as repetitive, subthreshold transfers designed to evade detection or mirror traditional smurfing techniques across multiple ledger addresses. By leveraging advanced blockchain analytics tools, compliance officers can track the historical flow of tokens, assigning precise risk scores based on how closely an asset has touched peer-to-peer mixers or darknet markets. Maintaining institutional integrity requires moving beyond static document collection toward this continuous, data-driven provenance tracking. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. When we think about financial compliance, we often focus on the movement of abstract numbers across digital ledgers. But value does not only exist in electronic currency. Criminal enterprises frequently encounter friction when moving large volumes of liquid cash through conventional banking channels due to strict transaction monitoring thresholds. To bypass these electronic barriers, they translate their illicit wealth into a physical form, utilizing the massive, chaotic flow of global commerce as a cloaking mechanism. This approach is known as trade-based money laundering, a highly effective technique where the primary objective is not the exchange of commodities for legitimate commercial utility, but rather the cross-border movement of value under the guise of an authentic business arrangement. By embedding illicit capital into the invoicing and shipping processes of physical items, perpetrators exploit a critical vulnerability. Financial institutions are experts at tracking money, but they are generally poorly equipped to verify the physical reality or true market value of the cargo moving through international ports. To systematically deconstruct this vulnerability, we must look at the specific mechanisms used to manipulate trade data, starting with over-invoicing and under-invoicing. When an exporter colludes with an importer to artificially inflate the price of a shipment on the commercial invoice, the importer can legally transfer a disproportionately large sum of money out of their jurisdiction under the pretext of paying a legitimate operational expense. The excess capital over the actual value of the merchandise is thus successfully laundered and positioned in the exporter's accounts. Conversely, under-invoicing allows value to move in the opposite direction. The exporter ships high-value commodities but generates an invoice for a fraction of their worth, enabling the importer to acquire significant wealth cheaply and later realize the full value by selling those goods at market price in their own country. These techniques demonstrate how the invoice becomes a highly malleable instrument when both sides of a transaction are controlled by the same criminal network or working in collusion. Beyond the manipulation of unit prices, money launderers also rely on complete structural fabrications, most notably through the deployment of phantom shipments. In a phantom shipment scheme, the physical goods described in the documentation do not exist, or at least they never leave the warehouse or enter the shipping container. The colluding parties generate a flawless paper trail consisting of fraudulent invoices, falsified certificates of origin, and counterfeit bills of lading to create the illusion of a complex international trade transaction. The financial institution processes the payment or executes a trade finance instrument, such as a letter of credit, based entirely on the face value of these pristine documents, unknowingly facilitating a pure capital flight across borders without any corresponding physical supply chain activity. This highlights a fundamental principle of compliance. Documentation can be perfectly consistent and completely manufactured at the same time, meaning that checking for administrative completeness is never sufficient to guarantee legitimacy. Detecting these anomalies requires compliance professionals to develop a sharp eye for specific red flags that routinely manifest within international trade documentation. A primary indicator is a glaring discrepancy between the declared value of the cargo on the invoice and its actual, verifiable market value, particularly when dealing with bulk commodities or standardized industrial components where market prices are publicly indexed. We must also scrutinize the documentation for vague, ambiguous, or overly generalized descriptions of the merchandise, such as labeling high-end electronics simply as mechanical parts to deliberately obfuscate the underlying valuation. Furthermore, highly irregular or completely illogical shipping routes, unexplained transshipment points through high-risk jurisdictions, or the sudden alteration of key counterparties right before delivery suggest that the logistical path is being engineered to confuse tracking systems rather than optimize supply chain efficiency. Successfully mitigating the risks associated with global commerce requires a deliberate integration of trade monitoring capabilities directly into your broader compliance architecture. This cannot be achieved in isolation within a standard anti-money laundering unit. Instead, compliance officers must establish an active, continuous feedback loop with a specialized trade finance department. The trade finance team possesses the domain-specific expertise required to read complex bills of lading, evaluate shipping manifests, and recognize when an international transaction lacks genuine economic or commercial logic. By combining your transactional monitoring data with their granular operational knowledge, you can cross-reference wire transfers with specific customs declarations, ensuring that payments are tightly coupled with real cargo movements. This collaborative approach transforms trade compliance from a passive, retrospective review of historical files into a proactive defensive measure capable of identifying and disrupting sophisticated, non-monetary laundering networks before the value leaves the institution. See you in the next lecture. Hello. When we think about designing software systems, we often focus on the mechanics of the architecture, such as how data flows through our services or how components are decoupled. In anti-money laundering, a similar trap exists where organizations focus purely on the technical implementation of protocols, assuming that clear documentation and automated screening tools are sufficient to mitigate risk. However, a compliance program is not merely a static system executing deterministic rules. It is a dynamic human framework that relies entirely on the behavioral patterns of the individuals within it. This collective behavior forms what we call a compliance culture, an environment where regulatory adherence is treated as a core business priority rather than an administrative burden. For such a system to operate reliably, it requires a continuous feedback loop that is both top-down and bottom-up, ensuring that executive intent aligns perfectly with frontline execution. When this alignment fails, Even the most sophisticated identity verification systems become ineffective, as human error or deliberate negligence will invariably introduce vulnerabilities into the architecture. The foundation of this culture begins at the executive layer, often referred to in governance as the tone from the top. If executive leadership treats financial crime prevention as a secondary check-the-box exercise that exists only to placate regulators, that perspective implicitly signals to the rest of the organization that operational speed or revenue generation should take precedence over vigilance. Conversely, when leadership actively prioritizes compliance, allocating adequate budgetary resources and engineering capacity to the compliance function, that commitment cascades down through every management tier. This top-down pressure must be balanced by a bottom-up flow of transparent information, where frontline employees who directly interact with customers feel structurally safe to escalate anomalies. Money laundering techniques evolve rapidly, and the individuals best positioned to notice these emerging behavioral patterns are typically the operators executing daily customer onboarding and monitoring workflows. Without a reliable, uninhibited pathway for these observations to travel upward, leadership remains blind to the actual operational risks confronting the firm. To sustain this bidirectional flow of information, an organization must commit to rigorous, ongoing staff training that moves beyond superficial compliance overviews. Effective training programs do not simply ask employees to memorize a list of regulatory statutes. Instead, they focus on contextual understanding, explaining why certain verification steps exist and how specific transaction anomalies indicate illicit activity. When employees understand the underlying mechanics of financial crime, they shift from passive adherence to active vigilance, transforming the compliance framework into a resilient, adaptive defense network. Furthermore, policies and procedural changes must be communicated with absolute clarity across all departments, leaving no room for ambiguous interpretation regarding individual responsibilities. This requires breaking down departmental silos so that the legal team, risk analysts, front office staff, and software engineers share a unified vocabulary and a common understanding of risk thresholds. When communication is fragmented, gaps inevitably emerge between policy design and operational reality, creating systemic weaknesses that sophisticated bad actors are highly adept at exploiting. At the center of this ecosystem stands the compliance officer, an individual whose role is structurally analogous to an architectural gatekeeper or an independent quality assurance lead. For this role to be meaningful, the compliance officer must be explicitly empowered by executive leadership, possessing the institutional authority to halt high-risk business relationships or flag transactions without fear of professional reprisal. If a compliance officer is subordinated to business development interests, or if the culture penalizes them for raising valid concerns that might delay a lucrative transaction, the entire compliance infrastructure becomes compromised. True empowerment means providing the compliance function with direct access to the board of directors, ensuring that their critical evaluations cannot be diluted or suppressed by intermediary management layers. This structural independence creates an environment of psychological safety, which is a necessary prerequisite for any robust risk mitigation framework. When compliance officers are treated as strategic partners rather than operational bottlenecks, they can effectively cultivate an organizational climate of transparency and accountability. Ultimately, a deeply embedded culture of compliance serves as an organization's most reliable defense against systemic failure and catastrophic regulatory enforcement actions. While automated transaction monitoring algorithms and cryptographic identity verification tools are indispensable components of modern compliance, they remain tools that require human oversight, interpretation, and intervention. A firm with weak internal culture will invariably suffer from alert fatigue, ignored red flags, and decoupled operational processes, leaving it highly vulnerable to exploitation by money launderers and sanctions evaders. By contrast, an institution that fosters genuine vigilance across every layer ensures that its defensive posture remains resilient even as criminal methodologies shift. As we think about building and maintaining these complex compliance architectures, we must always remember that systemic robustness is a direct reflection of human behavior, making culture the ultimate bedrock upon which all operational security rests. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. Today we examine the mechanics of independent testing and audits, which serve as the objective validation mechanism for your entire anti-money laundering framework. An anti-money laundering program cannot reliably evaluate its own efficacy from the inside, which is why regulatory frameworks mandate a regular, independent review. This structural requirement functions much like automated software testing, where the engineers who wrote the production code are not the ones defining the end-to-end validation suite. In a compliance context, the scope of an independent audit encompasses a comprehensive evaluation of your entire operational framework, including customer due diligence records, suspicious activity reporting systems, and staff training history. The methodology relies heavily on sampling and transaction testing, meaning auditors will select a statistically valid subset of customer files to verify that risk classification frameworks and beneficial ownership rules were applied correctly. They will trace specific alerts from detection to resolution to ensure no systemic gaps exist in your monitoring logic. The objective is not merely to verify that policies exist on paper, but to gather empirical evidence that those policies are consistently executed in daily operations. Ultimately, this rigorous process provides senior management with a clear, unvarnished view of the organization's actual risk posture. To understand the value of this process, we must delineate the sharp boundary between internal self-assessments and true independent third-party testing. A self-assessment is an internal management tool, often conducted by the compliance team itself, designed to monitor ongoing adherence to protocols and catch obvious operational drift. While useful for real-time adjustments, self-assessments inherently lack the structural detachment required to challenge deep-seated assumptions or blind spots within the program. Independent testing, conversely, must be executed by individuals with no direct involvement in the development, implementation, or daily operation of the anti-money laundering functions being evaluated. This testing can be performed by an internal audit department, provided they report directly to the board rather than compliance management, or by an external consulting firm specializing in financial crime validation. The independent auditor brings an external perspective and a standardized testing methodology that strips away internal biases, ensuring that the evaluation resists institutional inertia. By relying on an outside pair of eyes, the organization ensures that the evaluation is both objective and legally defensible when scrutinized by state regulators. When an auditor uncovers deficiencies, the organization must transition from identification to systematic remediation without delay. Identifying a control gap, such as a failure to properly escalate high-risk beneficial ownership structures or a lag in processing adverse media alerts, is only the diagnostic phase of the audit cycle. Once a finding is logged, the compliance function must construct a formal remediation plan that addresses the root cause rather than just the superficial symptom. If an auditor notes that 5 sampled files lack sufficient source of funds documentation, simply fixing those 5 files is an inadequate response. A robust remediation strategy requires analyzing why the system allowed those files to pass validation, updating the underlying controls, and potentially retraining the onboarding staff. Every single corrective action must be documented meticulously, establishing a clear timeline that demonstrates to regulators that management takes vulnerability seriously. Prompt remediation prevents minor operational friction from compounding into systemic failures that could trigger severe regulatory enforcement actions or financial penalties. A professional compliance program treats the audit cycle not as an episodic disruption, but as a continuous loop of optimization and structural improvement. The threat landscape shifts constantly as money launderers discover new vulnerabilities in digital onboarding pipelines and complex corporate vehicles, meaning a static compliance program degrades automatically over time. By embedding independent audits into your yearly operational calendar, you create a structured cadence for pressure testing your controls against these evolving tactics. The data and insights generated during each audit cycle feed directly back into your risk assessment models, allowing you to fine-tune your transactional filters and eliminate redundant operational friction. This continuous feedback loop ensures that your anti-money laundering systems remain highly optimized, balancing regulatory compliance with operational efficiency. Documenting this ongoing evolution provides concrete evidence to examiners that your institution possesses a mature, self-correcting compliance culture. I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome back. When we build and maintain an anti-money laundering infrastructure, it is tempting to treat compliance as a static problem with a fixed solution. We design our customer due diligence workflows, establish our risk classification rules, and configure our screening engines based on the laws of today, assuming the architecture will hold. But the financial crime landscape shifts constantly, and the rules governing our compliance functions are moving targets. Treating compliance as a one-time engineering task is a structural design flaw that invariably leads to systemic failure when the regulatory ground moves beneath us. To survive over time, our compliance framework must be built for continuous mutability, treating regulatory evolution not as an unannounced emergency, but as a predictable stream of incoming data. Staying ahead of global directives requires a systematic mechanism for ingest rather than relying on ad hoc observation or reactive panic. We must actively monitor international bodies, national financial intelligence units, and local legislative packages to capture shifts long before they become binding law. For instance, looking closely at how major structural updates roll out across jurisdictions helps us understand the timeline of shifting requirements. Consider the transition within the European Union toward a centralized single rulebook under the Anti-Money Laundering Authority, alongside the phased implementation of crypto asset reporting frameworks globally. If we operate across multiple borders, we cannot simply wait for a single harmonized baseline to emerge organically. Instead, our monitoring function must systematically catalog updates from sources like the Financial Action Task Force or FinCEN, ensuring that every upcoming variance is captured early. The structural tool we use to manage this incoming stream of legal information is a formalized regulatory change register. This register is essentially a centralized ledger that tracks every relevant regulatory announcement, its origin, its effective date, and its current state of internal review. When a new guidance document or directive is published, the compliance team must immediately assess its applicability to our specific business model and geographic footprint. We evaluate the document to determine whether it alters our definition of politically exposed persons, lowers our beneficial ownership thresholds, or introduces new transaction monitoring triggers. Each entry in the register must map directly to our existing internal controls so we can see exactly which parts of our system are affected. By maintaining this ledger, we transform an unstructured mess of external press releases and legal texts into an ordered, trackable database of engineering requirements. Once a change is logged and its technical applicability is confirmed, we must determine its precise operational impact through an objective evaluation process. Not every adjustment demands a complete rewrite of our core screening systems, but we must systematically look for gaps between the new rule and our current state. We analyze how the change alters specific components of our architecture, such as whether a new rule requires our customer risk rating engines to move to an exhaustive, trigger-based classification model. This impact assessment looks beyond the compliance department to identify which business units, technology stacks, and operational workflows will feel the ripple effects. We measure the delta between what our systems currently execute and what the new text mandates, documenting our conclusions explicitly within the register. This structured analysis prevents us from underestimating the technical work required or missing hidden dependencies across different systems. With the impact clearly quantified, we translate those findings into a dynamic, agile compliance roadmap that schedules the necessary engineering and policy updates. This roadmap cannot be a rigid multi-year plan carved in stone. It must function as a prioritized backlog that adapts as new deadlines are announced or existing timelines shift. We line up implementation sprints based on the statutory effective dates, leaving clear buffers for system testing, configuration changes, and staff training. For example, if a jurisdiction fast-tracks an update to treat stablecoins under strict asset freezing mandates, that requirement must move to the front of the implementation queue. The roadmap balances these urgent reactive changes with long-term structural upgrades to our data architecture and reporting interfaces. By managing our compliance tasks as an agile backlog, we ensure the institution is working on the highest priority regulatory risks at any given moment. Executing these roadmap updates smoothly requires continuous, deliberate communication with internal stakeholders across the entire organization. Compliance changes rarely happen in a vacuum, and a technical change to a customer onboarding workflow can easily disrupt the frontline business operations if handled poorly. We must engage executive leadership, product owners, legal counsel, and the engineering teams early in the life cycle of the change to secure explicit buy-in and coordinate delivery timelines. If a new regulation demands the collecting of additional corporate data or deeper verification of a source of funds, the product teams need adequate lead time to modify the user interface. Clear communication channels prevent operational friction, minimize internal resistance, and ensure that resource allocation is aligned across departments. When everyone understands the legal driver behind an operational shift, the organization can implement the update cohesively without breaking existing business processes. Ultimately, building agility directly into the compliance architecture is the only reliable way to maintain continuous compliance without experiencing costly operational disruptions. Institutions that rely on manual, reactive patches find themselves trapped in a cycle of constant firefighting, rushing out rushed fixes whenever an auditor identifies a deficiency. By contrast, an agile compliance function treats change management as a standard, repeatable business process governed by data, registers, and roadmaps. This proactive stance ensures that updates to screening algorithms, database structures, and background checks are planned, tested, and deployed well ahead of legal deadlines. We avoid the severe financial penalties and reputational damage that follow a compliance breach by executing these transitions systematically. When our compliance framework is inherently adaptable, the rapid shifting of the financial crime landscape ceases to be a systemic threat to our stability. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. It is good to have you here as we approach the final stretch of our journey. Defensive strategies in the domain of anti-money laundering compliance are entering a fundamentally new phase of operational maturity. For years, financial institutions treated compliance as a series of disconnected, periodic checkpoints designed primarily to satisfy regulatory examinations at a specific point in time. This static model is entirely inadequate against contemporary financial crime networks, which exploit sub-second settlement systems, programmatic micro-laundering, and deeply nested legal structures across multiple jurisdictions. The core elements we have explored throughout this course, including robust customer identification, rigorous verification of ultimate beneficial ownership, and risk-based customer due diligence, must no longer be viewed as static onboarding gates. Instead, an effective compliance framework requires a continuous loop of data ingestion, behavioral profiling, and rapid escalation. The evolution of illicit financial flows demands an equivalent architectural shift toward dynamic, event-driven systems that treat customer risk not as a permanent label, but as a variable state under constant evaluation. A modern program stands or falls on its ability to transition from scheduled periodic reviews to perpetual customer due diligence. In practice, this means your customer monitoring systems must automatically ingest and analyze real-time data feeds, triggering immediate risk reassessments whenever significant changes occur. Such triggers might include a sudden alteration in corporate ownership structure, an unexpected spike in high-risk cross-border wire transfers, or the appearance of adverse media related to associated parties. When these anomalies occur, the system must immediately adjust the customer risk rating and route the file for enhanced due diligence or investigation without waiting for a predetermined annual review cycle. The resulting audit trail must be completely transparent, clearly documenting exactly why a risk rating changed, who evaluated the change, and what specific controls were applied. By maintaining this continuous level of scrutiny, compliance teams can generate high-fidelity data that dramatically improves the accuracy of suspicious activity reporting while reducing the operational burden of false positives. Synthesizing this knowledge requires a clear understanding that technology alone is not a panacea. It is an amplifier of human intent and institutional culture. As automated analytics and machine learning tools become standard infrastructure for identifying transaction anomalies, the burden of qualitative decision-making shifts heavily onto the compliance professional. Regulators no longer accept superficial adherence to internal policies or black box automated systems that cannot explain the underlying logic of a risk decision. Your daily operations will demand a rigorous combination of technical literacy and forensic skepticism to independently evaluate automated alerts and construct defensible reporting decisions. This requires cultivating a proactive organizational culture where compliance is integrated into the broader operational fabric rather than treated as an isolated cost center. Ultimately, the integrity of the global financial system depends on your willingness to maintain intellectual curiosity, execute meticulous documentation, and exercise unwavering ethical judgment against increasingly sophisticated actors. Thank you for your dedication throughout this course, and I wish you the absolute best in your compliance operations.